Hey, welcome to Sleep Crime Stories. Before we begin, let me ask, where are you watching from, and what time is it there? A quick comment and a subscribe go a long way, it really helps. Now, turn down the lights, and let's begin tonight's case. A young woman vanished without a trace, as if she had simply dissolved into thin air. Everything around her seemed perfectly ordinary, but one morning she just didn't come home. There were no calls, no signs, only a haunting silence and a flood of unanswered questions. What could have happened in those few hours? Who was the last person to see her? Her disappearance marked the beginning of a dark and twisted story, full of secrets and suspicions, one that left everyone who knew her shaken and turned into a nightmare far worse than anyone could have imagined. April 2021 became a pivotal moment in the life of Asel Akpaiva. She had long dreamed of a better life, of opportunities that would allow her and her loved ones to live more comfortably. Then, an offer that seemed like a guiding light appeared. It came from Murat Murbakov, her cousin's husband. Murat, whom she had known for years, was working in Georgia selling cars and suddenly reached out, explaining he urgently needed an assistant. He assured Asel that the work would be straightforward and even promising, helping with paperwork and handling vehicle transfers for clients from Kazakhstan. For Asel, it felt like an unexpected chance, almost a gift from fate. Murat described in detail that her responsibilities would involve preparing documents for customers, arranging meetings, and overseeing the vehicle sales process. He explained that the car market in Georgia was booming with high demand for used cars, especially among Kazakhs looking for more affordable options. He also mentioned that his team was friendly and welcoming, ready to help Asel settle in and feel at ease. To her, the offer seemed like a long-awaited escape from her cycle of problems and limitations. A salary of $500 a month, paid housing, and a flexible schedule, everything appeared perfect. Asel had never had such promising prospects, and she felt her dreams might finally be within reach. The idea of working abroad filled her with hope for financial independence and the possibility of a brighter future. She envisioned saving up for her own apartment, setting aside money to support her parents, and providing for them in their later years. These hopes gave her strength and a sense of certainty that she was making the right choice. Asel grew up in the small village of Kabinbaybadar, located in Kazakhstan's Akmola region. Surrounded by vast, endless steppes, she spent most of her life in this place, watching as many of her classmates settled into the typical village routines, marrying young, working on local farms, or finding jobs in nearby agricultural businesses. Life in the village offered limited choices, with opportunities often reduced to a daily struggle just to get by. But Asel dreamed of something more. She was captivated by the allure of big cities, the prospect of changing her destiny, and the hope of achieving something greater. After graduating high school, Asel moved to Nur-Sultan to find her place in the world. There, she secured a job as a receptionist at a fitness club and lived with her older sister, who supported her during the tough times. Working as a receptionist provided a steady income, but the pay was modest, and the dream of owning her own apartment remained distant and almost unattainable. She saved every extra 10 she could, cutting back on little things, all while holding on to the vision of one day having her own space, a place where no one could tell her how to live, where she could create a cozy home and enjoy the independence she longed for. Asel believed that she could change not only her own fate, but also improve her family's circumstances. She wanted to give back to her parents, who had worked tirelessly to raise her and ensure she had everything she needed. Yet, month after month, reality made it clear that her dreams were still a long way off. She knew that in her homeland, reaching the level of financial stability needed to provide for herself and her loved ones would be nearly impossible. Her job at the fitness club offered a small measure of stability, but none of the opportunities she so deeply desired. Then came an offer from Murat Murbakov, her cousin's husband, to work in Georgia. To Asel, this seemed like the chance she had been waiting for. Murat had a reputation for being someone who understood business, and he spoke with confidence about the opportunities he could offer. He explained that he needed an assistant to help with paperwork and manage client relations as he handled car sales in Georgia, catering to buyers from Kazakhstan who wanted more affordable vehicles. Asel didn't take the offer lightly. She thought about it for a long time, weighing the risks, and had many conversations with her older sister, who was initially hesitant. Her sister worried about Asel going to a foreign country, far from home, surrounded by unfamiliar people. Murat, however, was persuasive, assuring them that Georgia was safe, that he would personally look out for her, and that the job could be a great stepping stone toward a brighter future. Despite understanding the risks, Asel's desire to change her life outweighed her fears and doubts. She couldn't shake the feeling that this might be her one shot to break free from the limitations of her current situation. She knew it wouldn't be easy, but she believed she could face any challenges that came her way, confident that this was her chance to transform her future. Asel made the decision to accept the offer, despite all her doubts and anxieties. This was her opportunity to break free from her routine, and she was determined to make the most of it. Asel's family supported her, even though they couldn't provide much financial assistance. Her parents and sister did everything they could to back her emotionally, sharing in her hopes and dreams, despite living modestly themselves. At the time, Asel had no way of knowing that this opportunity would set off a chain of unpredictable events that would change everything. Soon after, Asel flew to Georgia, filled with a mix of excitement and hope. This move felt like the beginning of a promising new chapter in her life. Upon arriving, she moved into an apartment in Rustavi, owned by Murat Murbkov. The apartment was small and furnished with older pieces, but Murat reassured her it was just temporary, a place for her to stay until she got settled and found something better. At first, Asel kept in regular contact with her family, sharing her experiences about her new life. She described the city with its old streets and unique architecture, and enthusiastically spoke about the local cuisine she was trying. Even the little things, like evening walks through Rustavi, delighted her. Everything seemed so fresh and intriguing. Her voice carried a genuine sense of excitement, and she sounded happy and confident in her decision. Whenever she called home, her mother could hear the joy in her voice. Asel spoke fondly of the local customs and the people she met, who seemed warm and welcoming. However, a few weeks later, things started to change. Asel began calling less frequently, and her conversations grew shorter and more guarded. There were traces of exhaustion in her voice, and at times, a hint of worry she seemed to be hiding. When her mother asked if anything was wrong, Asel gave vague answers, usually blaming work for her fatigue. She insisted that everything was fine, but her words sounded less convincing than before. Her mother grew increasingly uneasy, trying to reach her daughter more often, but many calls went unanswered. Each conversation grew more brief and restrained, raising even more concerns among her family. One day, Asel's mother managed to reach her through a video call. She waited anxiously for the screen to show her daughter's face. Instead of the familiar setting, the screen revealed a room she didn't recognize. The space appeared disorganized and unsettling. Belongings were scattered around, and the furniture looked like it had been hastily rearranged, as if someone had left in a rush or didn't care about keeping things tidy. Alarmed, her mother asked what was going on and why the room looked that way. Asel offered no clear explanation, brushing it off with excuses about being busy, and she ended the call quickly, mentioning she had a lot of work to do. Her mother's worry only deepened, her sense of dread growing stronger with each unanswered question and each brief, evasive conversation. On the morning of May 6th, in the Didi Daigomi district of Tbilisi, a passerby made a chilling discovery: the lifeless body of a young woman lying beneath the windows of a high-rise building. She was wearing only a t-shirt, and initially no one knew her name. But soon, investigators would identify her as Asel Atpeiva. Her final words, sent as a voice message to her best friend, would become a crucial piece of evidence in the case. In the hours leading up to that tragic moment, repeated attempts to contact Asel had gone unanswered. The worry intensified late on May 5th, when Asel's friend received a voice message from her. In the recording, a man's voice could be heard speaking harshly to Asel, accusing her of using him for her own benefit. The man called himself Besso. His tone was filled with anger, and he made threats against Asel, blaming her for betraying him and insisting that she would have to pay for it. When Asel's friend heard the message, She was overcome with a sense of dread. Fear for her friend's safety gripped her, and she knew things were getting dangerously out of hand. In the same message, Assel revealed that Besso had resorted to physical aggression, leaving her terrified and shaken. She spoke about having nowhere to run, feeling trapped, and being at a complete loss as to where to turn for help. The friend tried to call her back immediately, but the calls kept failing, and Assel did not respond, only deepening the growing fear. Meanwhile, suspicions began to circle around Murat Murbikov, a distant relative of Assel, who had lured her to Georgia with the promise of work. Investigators would later uncover that Murbikov had taken advantage of Assel's vulnerable situation twice, subjecting her to severe mistreatment and violating the trust she had placed in him. He exploited the fact that she was alone in a foreign country with no support system. After this, he handed her over to a man named Besso, either in exchange for a car or for some promised payment. Assel was left stranded, effectively trapped, where each day brought new dangers. She felt she couldn't go to the authorities, fearing they wouldn't believe her, or that reporting the situation might make things even worse. The isolation and helplessness were overwhelming, and any possible escape seemed out of reach. Her final conversation with her friend revealed the depth of Assel's fear for her life. Desperation and terror filled her voice, and she had no idea how she could ever get out of this situation. Her friend wanted to help, but was powerless to intervene in time. On the morning of May 6th, Assel's body was discovered under the windows of that high-rise building. The identity of the man connected to the tragic case of Assel Atpeiva was confirmed by Georgian authorities. He was Besik Tordabayev, known in criminal circles as Besso, a 57-year-old Georgian resident with a troubled past. He had previously served a 10-year sentence for car theft and had a reputation for aggressive behavior. By the time Assel's death came to light, Besso had already left Tbilisi and was heading toward the border, attempting to evade capture. However, the police acted swiftly, and within a day, he was apprehended. Meanwhile, Murat Murbikov, the man who had invited Assel to Georgia, returned to Nur-Sultan immediately upon hearing of her passing, seemingly trying to avoid any consequences. Assel's family, friends, and the authorities were left in a state of uncertainty, struggling to piece together the events that had led to her untimely death. A few days before the tragedy, Assel had reached out to a friend, asking for a loan of 100,000 tenge, about $220, to cover travel expenses. She did not contact her family, likely not wanting to worry them, though her desire for independence ultimately worked against her. Her friend was unable to assist due to a lack of funds, a detail that later raised more unsettling questions among those close to her. The Georgian police initially leaned toward the theory that Assel had intentionally jumped from the window, but her family strongly disagreed. They knew Assel as a lively, optimistic young woman who was making plans for her future. She had believed that the job opportunity in Georgia would help her improve her financial situation and bring her closer to achieving her dream of owning her own apartment. The police's conclusions seemed unthinkable to them. Her mother was particularly alarmed by injuries on Assel's body that didn't align with a typical fall from a great height. When Assel's body was returned to Kazakhstan, her mother immediately noticed some disturbing details. There were no typical fractures that usually occur in a fall. Her arms and legs were intact, and strangely, her arms were positioned across her chest, which is inconsistent with the expected posture in such cases. Her head was also free of the usual trauma seen in falls from high places. Even more concerning were the internal injuries, a ruptured spleen and other organ damage, suggesting possible severe mistreatment before her death. The body also showed signs of multiple burns resembling cigarette marks, and several of her teeth had been knocked out, raising the horrifying possibility of torture. These unsettling observations only deepened the family's suspicion that Assel had suffered abuse in her final hours. Her mother couldn't believe that her daughter would take such drastic action herself. The grim details that emerged when her body was brought back home only led to more haunting questions, none of which seemed to have any clear answers. An examination confirmed that Assel had suffered mistreatment before her death. Her mother insisted that Assel's body had been placed under the windows of the high-rise after she had already passed, in an attempt to stage a scenario suggesting she had taken her own life. Despite these concerning details, The Georgian police refused to acknowledge any criminal involvement in Assel's death and did not conduct further investigations. Besik Tortabeev, also known as Beso, initially refused to cooperate while in custody. However, after investigators revealed that evidence confirmed an intimate encounter with Assel before she died, he admitted that there had been physical contact but claimed it was consensual. According to Tortabeev's account, everything started on April 30, 2021, when he found out that Murat Murbkov, the man who had brought Assel to Georgia, had twice subjected her to severe mistreatment. Beso claimed he was outraged and decided to teach Murbkov a lesson. He said he confronted and physically assaulted Murbkov, then threatened him to ensure he left the country and stayed away from Assel. Following this, Tortabeev allegedly offered Assel a place to stay at his home, promising to protect her. He claimed that Assel stayed with him for several days and that he tried to care for her, helping her cope with the trauma. He insisted that they built a sense of trust, and any intimacy between them was mutual and consensual. Tortabeev stated that on the night of Assel's death, he left her alone in the living room to take a shower. When he returned, she was gone. Beso described finding the balcony door open and looking down, seeing Assel's body on the ground below, beyond a fence. Panic set in. His criminal record made him fear that he would be blamed for what had happened, especially given his association with Assel. Tortabeev claimed he ran downstairs and approached the fence but didn't have the courage to climb over. After standing there for a few moments, gripped by fear, he said he fled the scene, terrified of being accused of causing her death. He admitted that he then decided to leave the city to avoid any potential repercussions. In July 2021, Besik Tortabeev passed away in a prison hospital. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, but Assel's mother insisted that he had been assaulted. The family suspected that his death might have been orchestrated to prevent him from standing trial. This happened while legal proceedings were still ongoing and Tortabeev had been facing a potential sentence of 8 to 12 years for his offenses. Before his death, investigators had started questioning his story after analyzing a voice message Assel had sent to her friend shortly before she died. In the recording, Assel mentioned threats from Beso and expressed fear of him. References to aggressive behavior cast doubt on any claims of a consensual relationship. Authorities suspected that Tortabeev may have coerced Assel, and this element of the case drew significant scrutiny. However, he was never formally charged with causing her death. The official stance remained that while his actions may have driven her to a desperate act, there wasn't enough evidence to press further charges. Assel's family and their attorney believed otherwise. They were convinced that she had been killed and that her death had been staged to appear as though she had taken her own life. This belief was supported by the injuries found on her body and details of her fall, which didn't align with what would typically result from a leap from such a height. Murat Murbkov was apprehended upon his return to Kazakhstan. He was charged with aggravated assault and human trafficking. Assel's parents believed he was directly involved in her death and filed a petition to have him extradited to Georgia to face trial. However, local authorities were slow to respond to their requests or to further investigate the case. It wasn't until photos taken by Assel's mother in the morgue were posted online that things began to change. The images stirred public outrage, prompting the prosecutor's office to take the matter more seriously. Assel's tragic death drew significant attention from both the public and journalists who launched their own investigations. Online, new, and sometimes unverified details began to emerge. Witnesses came forward claiming that on the night of the tragedy, they saw two men allegedly pushing Assel off the balcony. There were even rumors of a video recording of the incident, but police reported that they had found no evidence to confirm such claims. After arriving in Georgia, Assel sought protection by reporting Murat Murbkov's aggressive behavior to the local authorities, but her pleas went unanswered. The police failed to take any action, a fact that later came to light when Georgian journalists began investigating the case themselves. Amid the unfolding events, one of Assel's acquaintances in Tbilisi agreed to provide testimony. He shared that, just one day before the tragedy, Assel had messaged him in desperation. In her message, she spoke of Murbkov, stating that he had assaulted her twice. She described not only the physical pain but also the deep psychological distress she felt. She had asked for help but was reluctant to impose, still hoping she could handle things on her own. Assel felt trapped, stranded in a foreign country with no support network. She told her acquaintance that she was afraid of Murbkov but was trying to stay strong. She often mentioned feeling as though she was in a hopeless situation, yet she continued to believe she could find a way out. The investigation also uncovered additional details. Murbkov had not only offered Assel a job in Georgia, but had approached other young women from Kazakhstan with similar promises. He had assured them of high pay, housing, and career opportunities. Fortunately, none of them had accepted his offer. To some, he had sent particularly persistent messages, emphasizing the supposedly unique opportunities he could provide, but every one of the women had declined. Their families later expressed deep gratitude for their foresight, believing it had saved them from a potentially dangerous situation. By late July 2022, the case took a significant turn. Georgian forensic specialists conducted further analysis and discovered traces of Murbkov's DNA on Assel's clothing, an important piece of evidence. This supported witness statements and substantially strengthened the prosecution's case in court. In the end, the new evidence gathered through forensic analysis, combined with the work of investigative journalists, began to paint a clearer picture of what Assel had endured in the final days of her life. Despite the many obstacles, the truth was gradually coming to light. The trial of Murat Murbkov in Nur-Sultan became one of the most talked about events in Kazakhstan. Georgian investigators, who were invited to the proceedings, presented their collected evidence and findings, drawing even more public attention to the case. When Murbkov appeared in court, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he continued to insist he had no involvement in Assel's death or in any aggressive behavior toward her. He claimed he was innocent, asserting that he was the victim of false accusations. His detached demeanor and complete lack of remorse left those present bewildered and outraged. Murbkov's elderly parents, aware of the gravity of the situation, decided to offer an apology to Assel's grieving family. They hoped that their gesture might bring a small measure of comfort to the victim's loved ones. However, Murbkov himself remained uninterested in any attempt at reconciliation and continued to deny any wrongdoing. The prosecutor's statement was firm and unrelenting. He presented a narrative suggesting that Murbkov, in an attempt to strengthen his ties with a powerful Georgian figure named Bazik Turtabiyev, had handed Assel over to him for personal gain. The prosecutor emphasized that Murbkov was fully aware of Turtabiyev's criminal history and violent tendencies, and he knew he was putting Assel in serious danger. Turtabiyev was notorious, with such a fearsome reputation that locals avoided any interaction with him. The prosecutor argued that Assel was subjected to continuous pressure, and that the horrifying events that led to her tragic end were a result of her desperate attempts to escape an unbearable situation. She had been pushed to the brink, seeing no way out and experiencing extreme distress and hopelessness. During the trial, it was revealed that Murbkov was already a father of two, and his wife was expecting their third child. The court considered these circumstances as mitigating factors, implying that having a family should have dissuaded him from committing crimes. However, despite these details, witness testimonies and the evidence presented clearly pointed to his involvement in serious offenses. It became apparent that neither his family responsibilities nor his role as a father had stopped him from engaging in cruel acts. On August 2, 2022, the court delivered its final verdict. Murbkov was found guilty of human trafficking and acts of aggression. He was sentenced to 15 years in a maximum security prison. Additionally, the court ordered Murbkov to pay Assel's parents 5 million tenge, around $10,500, as compensation for the emotional damage inflicted. This amount was a symbolic acknowledgement of the pain and suffering endured by her family, even though no financial settlement could ever make up for the loss of their daughter. Despite the verdict and the compensation, Assel's family remained dissatisfied with the outcome. They firmly believed that the case was far from resolved and that Assel had been the victim of a calculated crime. Her loved ones were convinced that she had not only suffered severe mistreatment and exploitation, but had also been deliberately killed. Even after the conclusion of the trial, with a guilty verdict and compensation awarded, the court proceedings failed to alleviate the family's doubts or provide true closure. They continued to hold onto the belief that the full truth had not yet come to light and that Assel's case deserved further investigation. Still with me? Good, that means you're ready for the rest. Don't forget to hit subscribe if you want more cases just like this one. In September of 1993, an Italian high school student named Elisa Claps vanished without a trace in her hometown of Potenza. For nearly 2 decades, she remained a missing person. The last confirmed sighting of Elisa was at the local Holy Trinity Church, where she had met up with an acquaintance. It's often said that a dangerous criminal with a twisted mindset is not easy to identify among ordinary people. They have a frightening ability to blend in, appearing entirely normal, average, and unremarkable to those around them. Even more unsettling is their knack for covering their tracks, leaving crime scenes meticulously free of evidence. This is precisely why law enforcement can struggle to catch these perpetrators, often taking years to identify and apprehend them, during which time they may continue their horrific acts. Now let's delve into another unsettling case. Elisa Maria Claps was born on January 21, 1977 in the small mountainous town of Potenza, located in southern Italy. She was the youngest of 3 children in her family. Her mother worked as a simple clerk, and her father owned a small tobacco shop. Elisa grew up alongside her 2 older brothers, Gildo and Luciano. The Claps family was known for being strict and deeply religious, attending Sunday services together every week at their local church. Elisa was a bright and ambitious student who dreamed of becoming a doctor, driven by her desire to help others. People who knew her described her as incredibly kind, compassionate, and friendly. At the same time, she was innocent and trusting, always believing the best in others. She had an effortless way of connecting with people and making friends quickly. By the time she turned 16, Elisa had never been in a romantic relationship, despite the attention she received from her peers. With her warm smile and long, beautiful hair, she was certainly noticed by the boys at school. Yet, coming from a religious household, she politely declined all invitations to go on dates, a disturbingly persistent admirer. In early summer of 1993, a local man named Danilo Restivo began showing persistent and unwanted interest in Elisa. Danilo was 5 years older, and unsettling rumors about him circulated through the town. Elisa tried to keep her distance from this peculiar individual, who often attempted to lure her into isolated places whenever he had the chance. Her upbringing and natural kindness made it difficult for her to be harsh or dismissive, and Danilo seemed to misinterpret her politeness as encouragement. Elisa wrote about Danilo in her personal journal, admitting that he frightened her, but also evoked a strong sense of pity. She noted how he appeared lonely and troubled, which is why she always made an effort to be courteous, even though she was careful never to be alone with him. Whenever she interacted with him, she found an excuse to leave as soon as possible, often claiming she had important errands to run. In mid-August that year, the Claps family went on a vacation to Monte Giordano, a quiet seaside town. One day, while strolling through the peaceful streets with her brother Gildo, Elisa suddenly froze. Danilo was approaching them, and she gripped her brother's hand tightly, signaling him not to leave her side. Danilo greeted Elisa as if they were old friends, and even insisted he needed her assistance with something, asking her to come with him. Gildo immediately sensed something was wrong. Making up an excuse, he led his sister away. Later, he asked Elisa why she had reacted that way, and whether Danilo had hurt her. Elisa confessed that the man had been following her and that she was terrified of him, even though he had never harmed her physically. On September 11th, at around 5 p.m., the Claps family's phone rang. Elisa answered, and her demeanor quickly changed as she spoke to the person on the other end. Her expression became increasingly somber and agitated, which did not go unnoticed by her brother. When Elisa hung up, Gildo asked who had called. She admitted that it was Danilo. When Gildo offered to confront him, Elisa firmly refused, insisting she could handle it herself. She didn't want to create trouble for anyone, and believed she had everything under control. The mysterious disappearance at church on Sunday, September 12, 1993, Elisa's parents and brothers left early for a day trip to Naples, located about 90 miles from Potenza. Elisa had stayed behind, planning to attend morning service at the local church with her close friend, Elena. The plan was for both girls to head back to the Claps' home for lunch afterward. At around 10:30 a.m., Elisa left her house and headed toward the church. By noon, her family had returned from Naples, and her mother prepared lunch while everyone waited for Elisa and Elena. But as time passed, the girls still hadn't come home. At 1:45 p.m., there was a knock at the door. Elena stood on the doorstep, looking anxious. She asked if Elisa had come back yet, explaining that they had gotten separated at the church and lost sight of each other. Elena said she assumed that Elisa had gone ahead to her house, but her story seemed shaky, and she fidgeted uncomfortably, as if she were hiding something. When the family told her that Elisa was still missing, Elena became even more distressed. Under pressure, she finally admitted that she hadn't been honest. In reality, Elisa had stayed behind to speak with a young man after the service. It was supposed to be a brief conversation, no longer than 10 minutes, and the two girls had arranged to meet afterward at the park before heading to lunch. But Elisa never showed up, neither after 10 minutes nor after an hour. As the conversation went on, Elena reluctantly revealed that the young man Elisa planned to meet was named Danilo. Hearing this, Gildo's face grew pale. He immediately warned his parents and brother that Elisa could be in serious danger, and that they needed to start searching for her right away. Who was Danilo Restivo? Danilo Restivo was born on April 3, 1972, in Eris, a small commune in the Trapani province on the island of Sicily. He was the youngest child in a relatively wealthy family. Growing up, he was spoiled and accustomed to getting whatever he wanted, learning early on that he would never face real consequences for his behavior. His father always came to his defense, no matter what trouble he caused. In the early 1980s, the Restivo family moved to Potenza, where Danilo's father Maurizio established a highly successful business. Within a few years, Maurizio became one of the city's wealthiest and most influential figures, forging strong connections with local law enforcement and government officials. During his school years, Danilo was known for being odd, rude, and disturbingly aggressive. He was a withdrawn and cruel child, infamous for mistreating animals, a behavior that seemed to give him a twisted sense of satisfaction. He also had a troubling obsession with sharp objects. Danilo was repeatedly caught spying on girls in locker rooms, and no amount of intervention or punishment seemed to deter him. He continued these behaviors with a stubborn, almost compulsive determination, showing no remorse or desire to change. Danilo Restivo was a loner, largely avoided by his peers, and had no real friends. He had an unnerving habit of carrying scissors with him everywhere, and would often cut locks of hair from unsuspecting girls. Despite multiple complaints from parents, this disturbing behavior went unpunished. Danilo would take his trophies home, amassing a sizable collection of hair clippings. His family, oddly enough, seemed to dismiss this behavior as mere childish mischief, failing to see any red flags. As Danilo grew older, his behavior became increasingly alarming. His cruelty extended beyond mistreating animals. He seemed to crave causing pain to people. He continued to struggle with social interactions, particularly with girls, toward whom he often displayed aggressive tendencies and attempts to intimidate or hurt. The first victim Danilo had a younger cousin named Sonia, who was about a year and a half his junior. They attended the same school and often walked home together after classes. Danilo would frequently invite her to secluded areas, coming up with various excuses to lure her away. However, Sonia was wary of her cousin. Her instincts told her to be cautious, and her mother had explicitly warned her never to go anywhere alone with him. In the spring of 1987, Danilo finally managed to convince Sonia to follow him, promising to show her a secret hideout. Sonia, sensing something was off, decided to bring her 11-year-old younger brother, Angelo, along for safety. After school, the three of them ventured into a wooded area where an old, abandoned shack stood. Danilo suggested playing a game that involved blindfolding the participants. Trusting him for a moment, Sonia and Angelo agreed, and Danilo tied blindfolds over their eyes. A tense silence followed. Growing uneasy, Sonia adjusted her blindfold slightly to peek, and saw something terrifying. Her cousin pulling a pair of scissors out of his backpack and moving toward Angelo, preparing to strike. Sonia screamed as loudly as she could, startling her younger brother. Angelo, who still had his eyes covered, reacted instinctively, jerking away just as Danilo's hand swung downward. Instead of landing on his neck, the scissors slashed his shoulder. The sight of blood and Sonia's piercing screams seemed to stun Danilo, giving the children the precious seconds they needed to escape. Sonia and Angelo bolted from the shack, their screams echoing through the woods as they ran for their lives. Danilo chased after them, shouting threats and demanding they keep quiet about what had happened. Driven by sheer terror and the instinct to survive, Sonia and Angelo managed to outrun him, making it to safety. The parents of the injured children were horrified by what had happened. They rushed Angelo to the hospital, where doctors managed to provide life-saving care just in time. The boy had lost a significant amount of blood and came dangerously close to losing his life, but he ultimately survived. That very day, the parents filed a report with the local police, pressing charges for attempted assault with deadly intent. However, the case was swiftly swept under the rug and Danilo faced no real consequences. Rumor had it that his father used his considerable influence to protect his youngest son. Mr. Restivo, with the support of a local priest, promised Angelo's family that Danilo would be sent to a psychiatric facility for mandatory therapy to prevent any future incidents. Additionally, he covered Angelo's medical expenses and paid the family a substantial sum in compensation. Not long after, Sonia and Angelo's parents decided to move their family to Naples to escape any further contact with their dangerous relative. Despite his solemn promises, Danilo's father never followed through on his pledge. Danilo was not sent for treatment and never even saw a specialist. Mr. Maurizio Restivo was too concerned that a formal psychiatric evaluation might label his son as mentally unstable or a danger to others, which would irreparably damage his own reputation and social standing. A dangerous favorite, Danilo was expelled from 4 different schools due to repeated complaints from students and about his aggressive and threatening behavior. In the end, he had to resort to homeschooling in order to complete his education and earn his diploma. At 18, Danilo was called up for military service, as he was technically deemed fit to serve. Yet, within just a few months, he was discharged because of his erratic and unpredictable actions. Returning home, he continued to live under the protection of his wealthy and powerful father, who kept shielding him from accountability. Over time, Danilo's behavior only grew more disturbing. He would stalk girls he was infatuated with, spy on them through their windows, make creepy late-night phone calls in which he stayed silent, and subject them to unsettling harassment. His attempts to express romantic interest often escalated to aggressive behavior, such as trying to cut off locks of their hair or luring them to deserted locations. When these girls rejected his advances, Danilo responded in alarming ways, sending them packages containing fake explosive devices labeled with words like boom or letters detailing his unsettling fantasies. No amount of complaints to the authorities seemed to make a difference, as Danilo's father always stepped in to protect him. With this constant cover-up, Danilo felt invincible and beyond the reach of the law. To outsiders, he appeared relatively harmless, more like a local oddball than a manipulative or dangerous individual. This deceptive appearance is what evoked pity in people like Elisa, who felt a sense of compassion for him and even wished she could help. The search for the missing girl leads to the church. Elisa's parents and brothers wasted no time in launching a desperate search. Their first stop was the local church where she had last been seen. According to her friend, Elisa had planned to confront Danilo Restivo that day to ask him to leave her alone and stop seeking her out. Several witnesses were quickly found who confirmed seeing the high schooler talking to Danilo outside the church, but none of them could say where the two had gone afterward. Elisa's mother attempted to call the Restivo household, hoping to speak with Danilo. However, Danilo's father, Maurizio, answered the phone and refused to let her speak with his son. Growing increasingly alarmed, the Claps family drove to the Restivo residence, but no one came to the door. Running out of options, They contacted law enforcement to report Elisa as missing. When officers arrived at the Restivo house, they were met by Maurizio, who claimed that his son had left for Naples on some errands and wouldn't be back until the following day. Yet, it wasn't long before authorities discovered Danilo was actually at home. Returning to the house, the police insisted on speaking with Danilo and brought him to the station for questioning. They had to do so because his father repeatedly interfered, making it difficult to get clear answers. Danilo's story was full of inconsistencies. He admitted he had spoken with Elisa at the church, but claimed she had left soon afterward, while he remained there to pray. His account was vague and riddled with contradictions, and his visible anxiety made it clear he was not being honest. Danilo couldn't account for his whereabouts after leaving the church and couldn't produce the clothes he had been wearing that day, which he appeared to have gotten rid of. Investigators also discovered a pair of his shoes soaking in a tub filled with bleach, where they had been left for nearly 2 days. Naturally, any potential traces of blood had been destroyed. Detectives also noted a suspicious cut on Danilo's hand, which he couldn't adequately explain. He claimed he had tripped and cut himself on something sharp while walking away from the church, but he was unable to specify the location of the incident. Moreover, the wound appeared to have been inflicted by a sharp blade, which made his story even less credible. The prosecutor protects the suspect despite Danilo's evasive behavior, refusal to provide his clothes and shoes for analysis, and his tangled web of inconsistent statements. His father acted swiftly to defend him. Maurizio immediately hired 2 of the best defense attorneys from Naples to represent his son. Faced with these obstacles, the police handling the case sought permission from the city's chief prosecutor to obtain a warrant. They needed legal authority to search the suspect's home and to seize his clothing and footwear, hoping to find any evidence that could link him to Elisa's disappearance. Despite overwhelming evidence pointing toward Danilo's involvement in the disappearance of the young girl, the city's chief prosecutor displayed a surprising level of indifference. He refused to issue a search warrant for Danilo's home or the church where Elisa was last seen. The search of the church was only a superficial one, and the main priest, Father Domenico Sabbia, adamantly denied access to the locked upstairs room, which was secured by a wooden staircase and padlocked. Even when pressured, the prosecutor declined to grant a warrant to thoroughly investigate the church and its adjoining rooms. Suspiciously, Father Domenico spoke of Elisa in the past tense from the beginning, almost as if he already knew she was no longer alive. 3 weeks after Elisa's disappearance, the case made local news, with a segment highlighting Danilo as the prime suspect and displaying his photograph. Following this broadcast, the police station received dozens of calls from women who described being stalked and harassed by Danilo. They revealed that he had a disturbing obsession with women's hair and was known to carry scissors, attempting to discreetly cut off strands of hair from unsuspecting victims on city streets, in parks, and even on public transportation. Thanks to the perseverance of dedicated investigators, they finally managed to charge Danilo with providing false statements in the spring of 1995. He was sentenced to 2.5 years in prison. However, he served less than 2 months behind bars before his sentence was commuted to community service, ironically at the very same church where Elisa had disappeared. A new prosecutor and a fresh investigation. The investigation into Elisa's disappearance stalled until 1999, when police arrested the leader of a criminal organization. Although he knew nothing about Elisa's case, he divulged damning information about the city's chief prosecutor. According to him, the prosecutor was involved in corruption, accepting bribes, covering up crimes, and intentionally derailing investigations when asked. While these allegations were considered hearsay, and the informant was later charged with defamation, they prompted a significant change. A new prosecutor and lead investigator were assigned to Elisa's case, and they essentially started from scratch. This time, they were finally granted a search warrant for Danilo's house. Although the specific clothing and shoes he had worn on the day of Elisa's disappearance were nowhere to be found, the search uncovered something alarming. Danilo had amassed a substantial collection of hair strands from numerous girls carefully kept in his room. Under Danilo's bed, investigators found a large box filled with photographs of nude and semi-nude women. He had taken these photos himself, spying on his victims in locker rooms, fitting rooms, showers, and even through the windows of their homes. Disturbingly, He also kept a separate set of images depicting women with amputated limbs. It was clear that he had serious psychological issues, but none of this provided any new leads in the case of the missing Elisa Claps. When police tried once again to search the church 6 years after Elisa's disappearance, Father Domenico remained adamant about not allowing them to access the locked upstairs room. He went to great lengths to prevent the search, leveraging his connections and framing the investigation as an attempt to desecrate a sacred space, even rallying churchgoers against the officers. The move and a letter from the beyond with no solid evidence against Danilo. Even after the renewed investigation, he eventually left his hometown and embarked on an extended journey through Europe. He continued to stalk women, cutting their hair whenever he had the opportunity. However, without his influential father's protection, he had to be more cautious. If his actions risked legal consequences, Danilo would quickly relocate to another city or even another country. In the early 2000s, the Claps family received an unexpected letter, supposedly written by Elisa herself. The message claimed she was alive, well, and had run away with a romantic partner, with whom she was now living in Brazil. The writer asked her family not to look for her or try to make contact. But the handwriting was unmistakably different from Elisa's. Anyone could see the discrepancy just by comparing it to her school notebooks and personal diary. Furthermore, the letter was riddled with glaring grammatical errors, suggesting that whoever wrote it was poorly educated. The Claps family conducted their investigation and, unsurprisingly, their suspicions led straight to Danilo. He had been visiting his parents at the time, and had somehow decided to fabricate the letter, pretending to be Elisa, in a failed attempt to mislead her loved ones. A new victim on November 12, 2002, the quiet British town of Bournemouth was rocked by the brutal crime that claimed the life of 48-year-old Heather Barnett. Her 2 teenage children made the horrifying discovery after returning home from school. Heather's lifeless and mutilated body was found on the bathroom floor, lying in a pool of blood. Her throat had been slashed and her skull showed signs of multiple blunt force trauma, likely inflicted with a hammer. The most disturbing aspect of the crime, however, was that her breasts had been removed and placed beside her head. In Heather's hand was a lock of hair that did not belong to her. This hair had not been ripped out in a struggle, it had been neatly cut with scissors. Additionally, some of Heather's own hair had also been trimmed. These eerie details suggested that the crime might have been ritualistic in nature. Investigators soon turned their attention to Heather's peculiar neighbors, Fiamma Marsango, and her husband, Danilo Restivo. The couple lived next door, separated only by a thin wall from the victim's home. Heather had filed several complaints about Danilo, who had made unwanted advances toward her despite being married. Just before the crime, she confided in a friend that she was afraid of him. Heather worked as a seamstress, taking in custom orders from her home. Danilo often tried to visit her under the pretense of commissioning clothes. He never placed any specific orders, but was insistent on coming inside to discuss details. 2 days before the tragedy, after one of Danilo's visits, Heather realized her house keys were missing. She didn't connect this to her neighbor at the time, thinking she had simply misplaced them. Unfortunately, she hadn't yet gotten around to changing the locks. Danilo was one of the first people at the scene, arriving even before the police and emergency responders. He claimed he had been returning home when he heard the terrified screams of Heather's children and rushed over to help. Although officers brought him in for questioning, they quickly released him, as he came across as clumsy and harmless. However, Heather's children pointed to him as a person of concern, revealing that they also felt uneasy around their strange neighbor and mentioned the missing keys after his most recent visit. With no immediate grounds to search Danilo's home, the police decided to keep a close watch on him. It wasn't long before they caught him in an unsettling act. Danilo was found on the street, scissors in hand, stalking a young woman and attempting to snip a lock of her hair. Officers detained him, asked for his identification, and conducted a search of his vehicle. In the trunk, they found a disturbing collection, a set of knives, a change of clothes, and extra pairs of shoes. This, combined with his suspicious behavior, finally provided enough evidence to obtain a warrant to search his house. Investigators got a shocking surprise when they searched Danilo Restivo's home. They found several albums filled with locks of hair that he had cut from various women. In the bathroom, clothes and sneakers were soaking in a bleach-filled tub. But the most damning piece of evidence was Heather Barnett's missing keys, now lying in Restivo's room. While blood traces were found on the clothing, the bleach had damaged the samples so severely that they couldn't be identified. However, Danilo's DNA was discovered on a towel in Heather's bathroom, suggesting he had wiped blood spatter from his face with it. A body in the church attic and 2 convictions. As the investigation into Heather Barnett's murder continued, authorities uncovered Danilo's disturbing past. 9 years earlier, he had been the prime suspect in the disappearance of a high school girl in his hometown. At the time, investigators had failed to find enough solid evidence, and the girl's body had never been located. But now, with substantial proof of his violent behavior and no influential father to shield him, Danilo was tried, found guilty of premeditated murder, and sentenced to 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole. Then, in March 2010, 17 years after Elisa Claps had gone missing, construction workers discovered her mummified remains in the attic of the same church where she had last been seen. Her body had been hidden behind the locked door that Father Domenico Sabia had refused to open to police. By this time, Father Domenico had long since passed away, and his exact role in covering up the crime could never be fully determined, though it was clear he had harbored a terrible secret. Elisa's body showed chilling similarities to Heather Barnett's case. Her chest had been mutilated in the same way, and the cause of death was a slashed throat. Additionally, her undergarments had been disturbed, suggesting a violent, intimate assault. Fingerprints were recovered at the scene, and bloodstains on Elisa's decayed clothing matched both her and Restivo, who had injured himself during the attack. In Elisa's hand was a lock of hair that didn't belong to her, an eerie signature mirroring the evidence from Heather's murder. Restivo was tried in absentia for the murder of Elisa Claps, as he was already serving his 40-year sentence in the UK. With overwhelming evidence, he was convicted again, this time receiving a 30-year prison sentence for the crime. Once he completes his sentence in the UK, he will be extradited to Italy to serve an additional 3 decades for the horrific assault on Elisa. Authorities suspect that Restivo may have had many more victims, but his involvement in other unsolved murders and disappearances remains unproven. They were the couple no one could suspect of harboring dark secrets. He was a successful lawyer and she a skilled judge. But something went terribly wrong. What started as a love story ended in a tragedy no one could foresee. It was an ordinary evening in Kanpur, and the Circuit House colony lay in peaceful silence. Yet behind the walls of one apartment, within a government-provided residence, a mystery lurked that would soon upend the life of Pratibha Gautam, a respected judge who had moved to the neighborhood just a few months prior. Pratibha was known for her integrity and fairness, serving as a civil judge at the local court. Reserved yet determined, she had earned the trust of her colleagues and the respect of her neighbors. It seemed nothing could disturb the rhythm of her life until one fateful evening changed everything. On October 8, 2016, her husband, lawyer Manu Abhishek Rajan, embarked on a long drive from Delhi to Kanpur. The couple had been married for less than a year, and though their love was undeniable, the demands of their careers placed pressure on their relationship. Abhishek frequently stayed in Delhi, working at the Tish Hazari court, but made every effort to spend time with his wife whenever possible. On this evening, he envisioned their reunion as he drove, eager for the weekend they would share. The drive was lengthy, but Abhishek, accustomed to such journeys, stayed in touch with his wife as much as possible. He called her multiple times, but none of his calls were answered. At first, he assumed she was occupied with work or taking some well-deserved rest. However, as he drew closer to Kanpur, his unease grew. Why wasn't she responding? Why this silence? By the morning of October 9th, as the first light illuminated the streets of Kanpur, Abhishek finally arrived at the Circuit House colony. Parking outside their apartment, he dialed her number again. But the silence on the other end deepened his concern. He stepped out of his car and hurried to the door, pressing the doorbell as he caught his breath. But inside, there was only an eerie stillness. He rang again and again, then knocked, first softly, then with increasing urgency as panic took hold. The door, locked from within, indicated Pratibha should be home. Abhishek realized something was terribly wrong. With a heavy heart, he made the difficult decision to break in. After several forceful hits, the lock gave way. The door flew open and Abhishek stepped inside, holding his breath. What he saw in the living room froze him in place. Suspended from the ceiling fan was his wife. Her wrists bore cuts, dried blood had darkened on her skin, and the air was thick with an acrid scent. Abhishek's world collapsed in that instant. Everything else faded into insignificance. Cautiously, he approached her. When he touched her, the rope gave way and Pratibha's body fell to the floor. His chest constricted with terror and sorrow. He stood over her, struggling to accept the reality before him. Then, as if through a haze, he realized he needed to act. Abhishek dashed out of the apartment, ignoring the stunned gazes of the neighbors. He jumped into his car and sped off toward the nearest police station, Kamperkot. Bursting inside, he reported in a shaking voice that his wife had likely taken her own life. The officer listened intently, not interrupting, and promptly dispatched a team to the scene. This marked the beginning of an investigation that would seek to unravel the many questions surrounding Pratibha Gautam's final moments. What had happened to this strong woman? Why had her life ended so tragically? The apartment in the Circuit House colony was shrouded in an eerie silence as officers forced their way inside. They were immediately taken aback by the scene. The body lying on the floor contrasted with what Abhishek had initially reported. He said he found his wife suspended from the ceiling fan. He explained that in his panic, he had taken her down, hoping to help. But this detail raised questions, and the bloodstains on the floor and furniture only deepened their suspicions. Soon, senior officers and forensic experts arrived to begin collecting evidence. They took photographs and gathered physical clues while Abhishek stood by, his hands trembling and his face reflecting a mix of fear and shock. Outside, neighbors were starting to gather, exchanging uneasy glances and whispering about what might have transpired in the judge's home. Pratibha Gautam came from the small town of Orai in Uttar Pradesh. She was raised in a middle-class family where her father worked at a bank, and her mother instilled a sense of independence and perseverance in her and her younger sister. Pratibha's interest in law emerged early on, and after graduating high school, she moved to Lucknow to attend university. There, she not only completed her studies with distinction, but decided to pursue a career in the legal field. This ambition took her to Delhi, where she enrolled in graduate school with the dream of becoming a judge one day. It was in Delhi where her life took a significant turn. She met Manu Abhishek Rajan, a young and driven attorney who, like her, was aiming for professional success. Abhishek came from an influential family. His father, Judge Suresh Chandra Rajan, had a distinguished career, having served in various prominent institutions, such as the CBY and NGT. What began as simple conversations about career challenges and exam stress between Pratibha and Abhishek soon blossomed into something deeper: shared study sessions, hours spent in libraries, and long walks around the city. Their friendship evolved into a romantic relationship, and soon, they decided to marry. However, not everything went smoothly. When Pratibha told her parents about her intention to marry Abhishek, their reaction was strongly negative. They envisioned a higher status partner for their daughter, and felt that Abhishek, being just an attorney, was not suitable. The caste differences only added to their objections. Yet the couple's love was stronger than societal expectations, and they resolved to fight for their future together. In 2013, they both decided to apply for the junior judge examination. Pratibha dedicated herself fully to the preparation, spending nights studying, attending specialized courses and taking practice tests. Her hard work paid off. She passed the competitive exam and began her training. Unfortunately, Abhishek did not pass. It was a significant setback, but he chose to persevere, continuing his career as an attorney, focusing on criminal cases. Despite the disappointment, their relationship remained strong. In 2015, Pratibha Gautam started her position as an associate civil judge in Kanpur. It was a demanding and highly responsible role that required full dedication, but she quickly demonstrated she was up to the challenge. Her work ethic and fairness soon earned her the respect of her peers in the local court. Meanwhile, Abhishek Rajan continued his legal career at the Tees Hazari Court in Delhi, where his determination and professionalism garnered admiration from colleagues. On January 29, 2016, they made a bold decision. They secretly married at the Arya Samaj temple in Delhi. This was not an impulsive act, but rather a calculated step to take control of their future. They knew that neither family would approve of their union, so they decided not to inform them. The modest ceremony was attended only by a few close friends who helped organize the event. Shortly after, they officially registered their marriage, all kept under wraps from their families. Following the wedding, the couple tried to mend relationships with their relatives. Abhishek's family gradually warmed up to Pratibha, eventually accepting her as a daughter-in-law and even taking an interest in her life. However, Pratibha's family remained resolute in their disapproval. They couldn't forgive her for choosing a partner they deemed unsuitable due to status and background. On April 23rd, 2 months after the wedding, Pratibha and Abhishek hosted a reception in Delhi to announce their marriage. It was a vibrant celebration filled with joy, but Pratibha's parents' absence cast a shadow over the occasion. Her parents only found out about the wedding after it had already taken place. Despite Pratibha's repeated attempts to reconcile with them, they stayed distant, unwilling to accept her decision. This was hard on Pratibha, who hoped that with time their feelings would soften, but that moment never came. Eventually, Abhishek and Pratibha decided to move to Kanpur. Pratibha was provided with government housing in the reputable Circuit House colony. This became their new home, a quiet and secure place that allowed them to escape family tensions and focus on their careers. Abhishek stayed in Kanpur for a few months before returning to Delhi to continue his work. Their marriage had reached the 6-month mark. Despite the challenges, distance, family conflict, and the strain of their demanding careers, they remained supportive of each other, kept in constant contact, and met whenever possible. Pratibha and Abhishek cherished every moment they spent together, making plans, dreaming about the future, and believing their love could overcome any obstacle. On the morning of October 9th, Abhishek arrived in Kanpur to visit Pratibha and found her lifeless in their apartment. The police unit arrived swiftly, especially given Pratibha's status as a judge, making her passing not just a personal tragedy but a challenge to the system itself. Officers began meticulously inspecting the apartment and documenting any potential evidence. The scarf that had been around Pratibha's neck lay beside her body. Cuts on her arms raised many questions among investigators. What exactly had happened in that room, and why did the scene seem so unusual? Abhishek, trembling from shock and grief, provided his initial statement, recounting how he found Pratibha. He claimed that when he entered, she was suspended, and he brought her down, resulting in her body falling to the floor. The police ordered a forensic examination to determine the exact cause and time of death, but even a preliminary review appeared highly suspicious. The combination of wrist lacerations and suspension as a method of self-harm seemed unlikely. Investigators noticed details that didn't align with standard cases. The neck injuries were deep, with 3 distinct marks in a linear pattern, suggesting deliberate force. The scarf had left an O-shaped mark, a detail that stood out. In typical cases of suspension, the neck mark usually forms a V or U shape, but a circular mark could indicate compression while the person was lying down. This raised the possibility that someone might have staged the scene to suggest self-inflicted harm. Pratibha's arms told another story. 14 deep cuts, 6 on the right, 8 on the left. The wounds were precise and parallel, as though made methodically without haste. This did not fit the usual profile, giving the police reason to doubt the simplicity of the situation. News of the tragedy spread quickly. Reporters and camera crews began gathering outside Pratibha's home. Her father, upon learning of her passing, was in profound shock. He and his immediately traveled to Kanpur, consumed by grief and confusion about what could have happened to their daughter. Pratibha's body was taken for an autopsy at a local hospital, but the process was marred by issues. Transporting a judge's body in temporary means drew criticism from colleagues and community members. Upon arrival, her body was left in a corridor corner until the examination could begin, leading to public disapproval and questions about the police's handling of the case. The autopsy took place late at night, with medical experts working to piece together the complex and tragic puzzle. Abhishek spoke consistently about how he found his wife in that grim state. But when the forensic team arrived at the scene, it was clear that things did not add up. The ceiling fan he mentioned came under scrutiny. He said Pratibha had been suspended from it, yet the blood marks on the fan blades only deepened the mystery. The smudges appeared elongated, as if her arms had merely brushed against the blades, without the usual spatter patterns associated with physical harm. The scene appeared too pristine, too orderly. The ceiling fan itself raised doubts. It clearly wasn't sturdy enough to support the weight of an adult. If an attempt to use it had been genuine, it should have shown signs of bending or damage, but there were none. Investigators were starting to sense that something was off. According to Abhishek, he had broken down the apartment door to get inside. He insisted that he had to force it open. However, investigators quickly noted that the lock was only slightly damaged and still functioned properly. The door opened and closed without any issues, which didn't match his account of a forced entry. If it had been broken down, it wouldn't have operated so smoothly. This detail deepened the police's suspicions about Abhishek. His version of events didn't seem to align with physical evidence. During questioning, the lead officer focused on clarifying every detail. Abhishek described his drive from Delhi in meticulous detail, every stop, every piece of evidence, from toll receipts to surveillance footage, even his call logs. He claimed to have called Pratibha multiple times during his journey. The abundance of information he offered without much prompting appeared suspicious, as though he anticipated the questions and had prepared his answers in advance. Abhishek repeatedly asked to be allowed to leave, asserting that he had done everything possible to assist the investigation. But the police insisted on his continued presence for further questioning. As an experienced lawyer, he understood that there could be numerous details at the crime scene that might be crucial, and his extensive knowledge of these details made his story seem too smooth, too rehearsed. However, the real questions began to surface when investigators discovered that Abhishek did not immediately contact the police after finding Pratibha. Instead, he got into his car and drove to the police station, which was about 1 or 2 miles away from the apartment. In such a situation, most people would instinctively call emergency services immediately, but not Abhishek. He explained that he was in shock and confused, unsure of what to do. He claimed he had tried twice to seek help, but it turned out he only visited the station once. These inconsistencies, odd details, and discrepancies in his story led investigators to believe that they were dealing with something far more complex than it first appeared. Despite Abhishek's confident responses, he was starting to seem like a person who had answers for everything. Yet the truth about what really happened on that fateful day remained elusive. Investigators realized the resolution was still ahead, and that Abhishek could be the key to uncovering the mystery. Everything that happened in this residential colony was always under the watchful eyes of security. It was home to high-ranking government officials, with guarded entrances and security posts. However, when Abhishek discovered that the apartment door wouldn't open, he didn't seek help from the guards. Why not? This question immediately caught the attention of investigators, as anyone else in such a situation would likely seek assistance from those nearby. This lack of action appeared suspicious, adding to the growing list of concerning details about his behavior. Abhishek stated that after finding Pratibha, he drove to the police station. But another strange detail emerged. He didn't inform the guards at the entrance of the colony about what had happened when he left. He could have approached them, which would have likely expedited the call for police assistance. Instead, he simply got into his car and drove away. Investigators noted this as another red flag, casting further doubt on his account. When Pratibha's parents arrived at the scene, they were devastated by what they saw. Their grief quickly turned to anger. They openly accused Abhishek and his relatives of being responsible for her passing. They claimed that Abhishek had restricted her communication with her family, placed constant pressure on her, and created an unbearable living situation. Supporting their claims, Pratibha's father filed a report with the police, requesting that a case be opened against Abhishek under charges related to causing harm and coercion. He asserted that either Abhishek was directly involved in her death, or his actions had pushed her to this outcome. Pratibha was a successful and independent woman. As a judge accustomed to managing her life on her own, she had been self-sufficient for 6 years. Her relatives couldn't believe that she would willingly harm herself. They recalled that she had never shown signs of distress or negative intentions. This raised the question, what could have driven her to such an act? The autopsy, conducted on the night of October 9th by 4 experienced doctors, revealed shocking findings. The cause of death was asphyxiation, pointing to foul play. Marks consistent with being struck by a metal object were found on her body. There were also 14 cuts on her arms and wrists, and 3 deep lacerations on her neck. All signs indicated a struggle, a desperate attempt to resist before her death. The most surprising revelation came next. Pratibha was 3.5 months pregnant. This detail added new layers of questions to the investigation. How could a woman, expecting a child and holding a responsible position at work, decide to harm herself? Even if one considered that she might have inflicted the injuries and asphyxiated herself, the presence of bruises and other marks didn't fit that scenario. Why were there so many signs of harm on her body? During further interrogations, Abhishek began to show signs of unease. His previously confident responses gave way to uncertainty. He hesitated and contradicted himself, which didn't go unnoticed by investigators. These were clear signs that he might be hiding something. Eventually, he was taken into custody for further questioning. The police knew this case required careful handling. Abhishek was a lawyer, his father a retired judge, and his brother-in-law held an influential position in the judiciary. Any misstep could lead to serious repercussions. When Abhishek appeared in court to determine bail conditions, public pressure and his family's influence played a significant role. Instead of the typical period of detention, the judge limited his confinement to only 7 hours. This decision sparked disapproval among investigators and Pratibha's relatives, who believed that Abhishek received overly lenient treatment given the severity of the accusations. Following the completion of the autopsy, Pratibha's body was released to her family. Her relatives, including her parents and siblings, were devastated. They recalled how, in recent months, Pratibha had called home sounding subdued. She didn't share any details, avoided discussing her personal life, and now all those small signs seemed like missed warnings, clues they might have overlooked. Each day, the case grew more tangled, and the answers seemed further away. The police confiscated Abhishek's phone and began a thorough examination of all messages, calls, and emails. They discovered that tensions had been escalating in their relationship in recent months. Arguments over the future of their child and family plans were frequent, and almost every message from Abhishek was laced with irritation. This deepened the investigators' suspicions, though no one yet knew just how far these dark undertones would reach. Under the investigators' scrutiny, Abhishek faced long hours of questioning. The pressure mounted, and each new question and piece of evidence added weight to his burden. One day, overwhelmed with exhaustion and on the brink of an emotional breakdown, Abhishek finally broke and spoke words that changed everything. He confessed. The words came reluctantly, as though pulled from deep inside, a painful, unwilling admission. His acknowledgement of his role in Pratibha's death came as a shock and horror. Abhishek revealed that years of jealousy and resentment had built up inside him, clouding his thoughts and emotions. It all started when Pratibha earned her position as a judge while he, having failed the exam, remained an attorney. This disparity in status became a source of profound inner turmoil. He couldn't accept that his wife had achieved more than him and that her family openly expressed their disapproval of him. With each passing day, his feelings grew into something more destructive. Then came the news of her pregnancy. For Pratibha, it was a symbol of their love and a hope for the future. She believed the baby would strengthen their marriage and mend her strained relationship with her parents. Pratibha's mother was overjoyed, planning to support her daughter and even meet to discuss their future together. But for Abhishek, this news felt like another blow. Instead of joy, he felt fear and an even deeper sense of alienation. To him, The pregnancy represented further loss of freedom, more responsibilities, and an amplification of the rift that already existed between him and Pratibha. Abhishek's friends knew him as someone who preferred a carefree lifestyle. Parties, freedom, and minimal responsibility were all part of his character. Now, faced with the prospect of becoming a father, he was overwhelmed with fear. He began pressuring Pratibha to consider an abortion, but she firmly refused. Her unwavering desire to keep the child only intensified the tension between them. Every smile she offered, and every attempt to show him that their future could be bright, triggered new waves of frustration in him. He felt trapped. Things only grew worse. Abhishek started exerting even more control over Pratibha's life. He limited her contact with her parents and became increasingly jealous of her career and accomplishments. While Pratibha was independent and successful at work, at home, her world was filled with anxiety and control. In early October, Pratibha's mother expressed a desire to see her, and this became a breaking point. Abhishek reacted angrily. He couldn't bear that Pratibha had defied him and reached out to her family. He demanded that she stop all communication, but Pratibha stood firm. She declared she would defend her rights, keep her child, and not give in. Those words were the final straw for Abhishek. His jealousy, sense of failure, and fear of losing control all came to a head. He could no longer handle her strength and independence. The situation escalated on that fateful day. Now, sitting across from the investigators, Abhishek spoke of his fears, his consuming jealousy, and how he couldn't stand her success and self-reliance. But even after his admission, the investigators felt there was more to the story. It seemed likely that Abhishek had only shared part of the truth, and the deeper secrets of their relationship had yet to be uncovered. The events unfolded rapidly and unpredictably, beginning when Pratibha informed Abhishek she was heading to Delhi, despite his objections. This was on October 7th, while Abhishek was relaxing with friends at a resort. The news jolted him. He immediately decided to return to Delhi. He abandoned his break, left his friends behind, and headed home. On October 8th, Pratibha arrived in Delhi by train. She hoped a face-to-face conversation could change something in their relationship, but she was met by an irritated and angry Abhishek. He put her in the car, and the tension rose as they drove, escalating into a heated argument. The exchange turned into shouting, and at one point Pratibha had enough. She stepped out of the car in the middle of the road, declaring she was returning to Kanpur, and began walking away. Abhishek watched her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Do what you want," he shouted after her. But after a few moments, his emotions surged, and he decided to follow her. Abhishek drove through the night to Kanpur, a journey that took him around 9 hours before reaching Pratibha's apartment in the upscale Circuit House colony. It was early on the morning of October 9th, approximately 5 o'clock or 5:30 a.m. The colony was known for its security, and most neighbors kept to themselves, giving him a certain degree of freedom to act unnoticed. Abhishek entered the apartment, and the tension that had built over the past months erupted. He began striking Pratibha with a stick. He continued even as she tried to resist. When the blows failed to quell his anger, he used a blade to inflict cuts on her arms, body, and neck. Pratibha struggled to fight back, but soon lost consciousness and collapsed to the floor. Realizing she was still alive, Abhishek escalated his actions. He grabbed a scarf and wrapped it tightly around her neck, holding it until she took her last breath. Standing over her, breathless, he began to comprehend the gravity of what he had done. Now he needed a way to cover his tracks. He attempted to stage the scene to look like Pratibha had taken her own life by trying to suspend her from the ceiling fan. However, the fan was too flimsy and couldn't bear the weight. Threatened to break. Realizing this plan wouldn't work, Abhishek left her body on the floor. He quickly searched the apartment for anything that could incriminate him and took Pratibha's phone, knowing it could reveal his motives and intentions. Around 6 a.m., he left the apartment and walked to his car, trying to remain composed to avoid attracting attention before driving out of the Circuit House area. But he didn't go straight to the police. Instead, Abhishek stopped on a quiet street in Kanpur to gather his thoughts and plan what he would tell the authorities. He knew that every detail would be crucial. Only after 3 hours, around 9 a.m., did he go to the Kanpur police station. There, he reported Pratibha's death, claiming that he found her already lifeless in the apartment. The police quickly noticed inconsistencies in his behavior. Why had he waited so long to report the incident? Why hadn't he immediately sought help instead of spending time considering his next move? These questions stood out to the investigators. After taking his initial statement, Abhishek was detained for further questioning. Meanwhile, the police began a detailed examination of the crime scene. They found the scarf used in Pratibha's death, but the blade used for the injuries was missing. This raised more suspicions. It was clear Abhishek had attempted to hide evidence and mislead the investigation, signaling that uncovering the truth would require a thorough and complex inquiry. The day before the incident, Abhishek sent Pratibha's housekeeper and driver on leave, a move that initially seemed like a simple coincidence but was later revealed to be part of his plan. When Abhishek was taken into custody, his parents quickly went into hiding, avoiding all police summons. The court took notice and issued an arrest warrant for them, as well as an order to seize their assets until they appeared for questioning. In an attempt to protect themselves, Abhishek's parents filed an appeal with the Supreme Court. They managed to obtain a temporary stay on the warrant, but the court ruled that they needed to surrender voluntarily at the Kanpur court. On October 18th, Abhishek's parents appeared at the Chief Magistrate's Court to comply with the ongoing investigation. Meanwhile, Abhishek made numerous attempts to secure bail. He submitted petitions to various judicial bodies, including the Session Court, the High Court, and even the Supreme Court. However, each request was denied. The severity of the charges and the potential risk to the investigation made it impossible for him to be released. Years passed, and by 2022, Abhishek had spent nearly 5 years in prison. The legal battle continued, and in April 2022, after numerous appeals and countermotions, the High Court granted him bail. However, this was only a temporary measure. The case remained under review, with the final verdict yet to be determined. The police pressed on with their efforts to prove Abhishek's culpability, while his family, despite all their attempts, continued to fight for his exoneration. The final judgment is still pending, and both sides remain locked in a battle for justice as the investigation proceeds. When shadows from the past start to close in, it can feel like everything around you is set in stone. Can a person ever truly escape what fate has in store for them? Today's story is about a family that disappeared overnight, leaving behind a string of unanswered questions and the lonely echoes of unfinished phone calls. This is the story of Melissa Wolfenberger, which began with a sudden unexplained disappearance and turned into a true tragedy. It was November 26, 1998, when a quiet Thanksgiving evening at the Patton household was overshadowed by a sense of unease. Melissa, the youngest daughter of Norma and Carl, called to wish her parents a happy Thanksgiving. The conversation was typical, familiar, discussing plans for the upcoming holidays, choosing gifts, and preparing for Christmas. Melissa wanted her children to spend the holidays at her parents' house, as they did every year. "Mom, don't forget that old photo of Grandma. I'd love to have it framed under the tree," she said with a smile. But when Christmas came, there was no phone call, no knock on the door. Norma and Carl were worried, but still held out hope that their daughter and her family would show up at the last minute, as they sometimes did. But as the hours passed, no one arrived. Gifts lay beneath the tree, twinkling with festive lights, but the mood was somber, as the silence grew deafening. It all started on an ordinary day, but soon, concern began to grip Norma, as several days went by without a word from their daughter. Melissa had always found a way to reach out, especially if plans had changed. But this time it seemed different. The parents tried calling, but there was no answer. Attempts to get in touch with their son-in-law, Christopher, were also unsuccessful. Since they had their grandchildren, Melissa and her husband, along with their kids, lived in Atlanta, while Melissa's parents stayed in their cozy home in Last Grove, Georgia. In January, after the prolonged silence became unbearable, Norma and Carl got in their car and drove to Atlanta. They took the familiar streets leading to the duplex on Brooklyn Avenue. But what they found there made their hearts sink. The apartment doors were open, but inside, everything felt eerily empty and lifeless. The rooms were spotless, perfectly arranged, as if their daughter and her family had never lived there. It was as though someone had deliberately erased all traces of their existence. Norma went door to door, asking neighbors if they had seen Melissa or her children. One man recalled seeing them loading items into a moving truck shortly before New Year's, but no one knew where they were headed or why they hadn't left any forwarding address or message. It was as if they had decided to leave abruptly, without warning and with no plans to return. For Norma and Carl, it was unbearable. They knew that if something was wrong, Melissa would have definitely reached out to them. Their daughter had always been open and honest, and if plans had changed, she wouldn't have kept it a secret. Norma decided that they couldn't just let this go. If Melissa and her family had left, then someone had to know something. They tracked down the company where their son-in-law worked. It was a glass manufacturing firm, and management confirmed that Christopher had indeed been employed there as a truck driver, but he had recently been let go. The reason for his dismissal was that he had been involved in an accident with one of the company vehicles. When asked about Christopher's future plans, they couldn't provide any answers. He had simply vanished just like his family. Time passed, but there were no updates in January or February. Norma kept trying to reach out, but each new day brought only a fresh wave of disappointment. Her birthday in February was especially painful. Melissa had always called to wish her well, even if she was busy, but this time the phone remained silent. Norma finally began to realize that her daughter's silence wasn't accidental. Something terrible had happened. What could have driven Melissa to abandon her previous life? Norma and Carl struggled to make sense of it. They remembered how their youngest daughter was always cheerful and loving. From a young age, she stood out among her peers, actively participating in school beauty pageants and helping her older sister Tina with her projects. Together, they had dreamed of opening a veterinary clinic to rescue as many animals as possible. But those dreams faded into the past when Melissa's teenage rebellion led her into trouble. Legal issues, running away from home, and her first serious love. Christopher became her only anchor during those turbulent years when she was torn between parental rules and a desire to find herself. Marriage changed her. It seemed like things were finally coming together. She moved to the city with Christopher, had children, and their life appeared to be happy. But her still sensed something subtle, something unsettling, as if beneath the surface calm, there was a deep crack. And now, in January 1999, standing in that empty apartment on Brooklyn Avenue, those uneasy feelings had turned into a chilling reality. The questions kept piling up. What had happened to their daughter and her family? Why did all the leads go nowhere? And why did their attempts to find answers only lead to dead ends? Why had none of the neighbors seen Melissa after New Year's? And where had her children gone? And what was the significance of that photograph she had wanted for Christmas? These seemingly minor, insignificant details took on a sinister tone, creating the sense that something much larger was at play. Leaving it all unresolved would have felt like betrayal, and Norma kept searching for any information, grasping at the smallest clues to understand what had happened to her beloved daughter. A story that had begun with a simple family holiday had transformed into a grim, desperate attempt to find light in the darkness. And nothing could have prepared her for the truth that lay ahead. A truth that would turn their lives upside down. Melissa's older sister, Tina, who worked with her at a small bakery, was just as puzzled by her disappearance. The management at Denny's, where they worked, reported that Melissa hadn't shown up for over a month, and her coworkers said she simply stopped coming around, almost as if she had vanished into thin air. No one knew if she had gotten another job. They only mentioned that one day she didn't show up for her shift and didn't give any notice. Some of her coworkers even visited her home, but it was no use. Neighbors just shrugged, saying the family had moved out, but no one knew where they went. Time passed. The year 1999 dragged on, but there was still no word from Melissa. Carl and Norma were beside themselves, praying for their daughter's safe return. With each passing month, their hope faded, but they clung to it desperately, like a lifeline. They couldn't imagine any solid reason why Melissa wouldn't call, especially since she had always stayed close with them, even through her turbulent youth. It felt like a nightmare they would soon wake up from. But the nightmare didn't end, and reality only grew darker. By January 2000, the Patton family's patience had worn thin. Norma filed a missing persons report with the police. Detectives began an investigation, and it wasn't long before they tracked down Melissa's husband, Christopher Wolfenberger. At the time of Melissa's disappearance, he had also been out of contact for a while, but eventually he reappeared. However, his wife and children were nowhere to be seen. Christopher claimed that Melissa had left on her own. According to him, she had been dreaming of a new life, of moving to California, and one day she just decided to make that dream a reality. But Norma and Carl knew their daughter. They were certain she would never do that, and she would never just disappear without saying a word. Despite the parents' firm belief that Christopher was hiding something, the police found no grounds to pursue further action. Melissa was an adult, and if she had decided to head to California, she had every right to do so. Since her husband hadn't reported her missing, the police saw no reason to classify her as a missing person. Without any evidence of a crime, the investigation hit a dead end. Christopher stuck to his story. Melissa had been planning the move for a while. She worked double shifts at the bakery, saving money, and sometimes even rented a hotel room to avoid the long commute home after exhausting hours. This, he said, was how she was preparing for the next chapter of her life. One day, she just didn't come back, and Christopher assumed she had finally gone through with her plan, leaving for California on her own. He insisted there was nothing unusual about it, explaining it as Melissa's desire to start fresh. Detectives tried to put pressure on Christopher, bringing up his past. Wolfenberger's youth was far from trouble-free. Melissa and I were like Bonnie and Clyde, just on a smaller scale, he smirked during questioning. They did get into minor trouble. Their life seemed to be a series of impulsive decisions, even before they got married. But it soon became clear that Christopher wasn't telling the whole truth. The records showed complaints filed by Melissa. She had reported incidents of domestic aggression multiple times. According to her, it wasn't just about him raising his hand against her. On one occasion, he allegedly gave her prohibited substances and dragged her down the street by her hair, ignoring her protests. When Christopher found out about these reports, he filed a counterclaim. The legal battle grew more complicated. At one of the hearings, Christopher asked for permission to speak with Melissa alone. After a brief conversation that no one else could hear, Melissa withdrew her complaint and returned home with him. "We have kids after all," was all she said. After Melissa's disappearance, Christopher did something unexpected. He moved out of their shared home and went to stay with relatives. The kids stayed with their paternal grandmother, and Christopher only visited them occasionally. It seemed like he was trying to distance himself from his old life. Little Christina and Joy quickly adjusted to life without their mother, and they only thought of their father when he would show up at his mother's doorstep. Norma Patton had never liked Christopher. She believed he was the reason Melissa ran away from home shortly after finishing high school. To her, this marriage was nothing but a source of disappointment and heartache. He was never who he pretended to be, she often said, staring at photos of her daughter. Now that Melissa was gone, those words felt like a chilling prophecy. Her parents couldn't accept the idea that their daughter had simply walked away, leaving her life behind. What really happened to Melissa? And why were those who might have known the answer staying silent? As the fog of the past slowly lifted, a darker and more disturbing picture of the Wolfenberger family began to emerge, where happiness was nothing more than an illusion. In a conversation with detectives, Tina Patton recalled an incident from the past. She had noticed a bruise on Melissa's neck, shaped like a handprint. Melissa, usually composed and calm, broke down crying and begged Tina not to tell anyone. After that, one of Tina's friends wanted to confront Christopher man to man, but nothing ever came of it. It seemed like things had settled down, but it was only a facade of calm. Carl and Norma Patton couldn't accept the idea that their daughter had simply chosen to vanish without a word. Even if she had felt the need to leave her family, Melissa would have found a way to contact her parents. But as time passed, days and months turned into years, and there was still no trace of Melissa. A young woman, a mother of two, seemed to have disappeared into thin air. Christopher Wolfenberger, Melissa's husband, kept changing his statements. At first, he claimed the last time he saw Melissa was in December 1998, but during questioning in the spring of 2000, he suddenly stated that he had seen her on the street near their home in March or April of 1999. This inconsistency only deepened suspicions, but it didn't bring any clarity to the case. 5 years later, in 2003, the Patton family found themselves back in the spotlight. This time, it wasn't about Melissa, but Carl Patton himself. He had been arrested. It turned out that back in the mid-1980s, Carl had already had a run-in with the law. He served a short sentence for theft and was released on parole. Since then, he had tried to stay out of trouble, but his past caught up with him. More than 2 decades after the crime, his involvement was confirmed through DNA testing. On February 23, 2003, Carl was arrested for the death of 31-year-old Liddy Mae Evans. In 1977, her body was found in a river, wrapped in a sleeping bag and chained to a concrete block. The cause of death was a gunshot wound to the head. But this wasn't the only crime connected to Carl. Immediately after his arrest, Carl's wife, Norma, made a shocking announcement. She was willing to testify against her husband in exchange for immunity. The deal was made, and Norma began giving detailed testimonies that stunned everyone. According to her, between 1970 and 1977, Carl and his friend Joe Quint were involved in multiple crimes. It all started with the killing of Carl's uncle, Fred White, and his lover. Carl knew too much, and he convinced Norma to help eliminate any potential witnesses. Norma recounted how, on December 17, 1977, Carl lured his uncle and his uncle's lover to their home, where he used a shotgun to end their lives. Afterward, he and Norma wrapped the bodies in sleeping bags, attached weights, and dumped them in the river. Norma cleaned the house, washed away the blood, and Carl burned the blood-stained couch in the backyard. But the trunk of their van, which had blood stains, wasn't cleaned. When investigators found blood traces in the trunk matching the victim's blood type, Carl and Norma were questioned. But at the time, there wasn't enough evidence to press charges. It wasn't until 25 years later that DNA testing confirmed Carl's involvement. And on February 23, 2003, Melissa's father was taken into custody. After Carl's arrest, rumors began circulating about his possible connection to Melissa's disappearance. Some speculated that she might have been a victim of her own father, who couldn't risk anyone in the family talking, but there was no direct evidence to support this theory. Carl denied having anything to do with it, insisting, "I would never harm my daughter. I only dealt with those who threatened my family." But everyone knew there was a harsh truth hidden behind those words. The suspicions surrounding Carl weren't just about Melissa's disappearance. There were rumors that he had ties to criminal organizations operating in the southern U.S. as far back as the 1960s. He had a reputation as a cold-blooded shooter, but he always denied any involvement. In 2003, during the investigation into the death of Fred White and his lover, Norma revealed that Carl acted out of greed. The official marriage of Fred White entitled his wife to an insurance payout, and she had hired Carl to take care of her unfaithful husband. These old cases were handled by Detective Bruce Jordan. After 25 years, he was able to catch and convict Carl Patton, but it wasn't enough. Now Carl, sitting behind bars, reached out to Jordan with a plea: "Find my daughter. Find Melissa." This statement was unexpected, from a man who seemed to have no regrets. Suddenly, there was a concern for his missing daughter. For Norma and Tina, this brought a glimmer of hope, but also a wave of new fears. They worried that Melissa's disappearance was no accident, and that the mystery shrouded in darkness for so many years could turn out to be even more horrifying. When news of the renewed Wolfenberger case hit the papers, Detective Bruce Jordan immediately took interest. For years, the story seemed frozen, but a sudden lead from the Atlanta morgue changed everything. A forensic expert called Jordan and informed him that they had been holding unidentified remains in their facility for 4 years. Body parts found in different months of 1999, in the area where Melissa's family lived. Back in April of that year, A severed head had been discovered near the Wolfenbergers' home. 2 months later, limbs, arms, and legs were found in a wooded area nearby, packaged in trash bags. The torso was never recovered, and the remains were initially declared to belong to a male because they couldn't be properly identified. At the time, Melissa had not yet been reported missing, and so these gruesome discoveries were not connected to her disappearance. It was only later that the horrifying truth emerged. Those remains belonged to her. When Bruce Jordan received the information, he picked up on crucial details. The head and limbs were found very close to the glass company where Christopher Wolfenberger had once worked. Norma Patton recalled hearing about the disturbing discoveries on the news. But back then, experts had assured everyone that the remains were male. It wasn't until years later, after DNA testing was performed, that it was confirmed the dismembered body was Melissa. Carl Patton, Melissa's father, received the news while in prison. He couldn't hold back tears when he learned that her dismembered remains had been found shortly after she went missing, but had not been identified. What truly devastated him was the fact that the DNA testing, which could have brought clarity to his daughter's fate, wasn't conducted until after his arrest, nearly 4 years later. When Norma first reported Melissa missing in early 2000, her remains remained unidentified until 2003. Critical time was lost, along with vital evidence that might have solved the case much sooner. Forensic analysis revealed that Melissa's neck had been cut with a saw, and her skull had been treated with bleach, which initially led experts to believe the remains were male. The same chemical made it impossible to determine whether the injuries were inflicted before or after death. Her head and limbs were packed in trash bags and scattered along busy roads, making it nearly impossible to track the perpetrator's vehicle. The exact time and cause of death remained unknown, as her torso was never found. Christopher was brought in for questioning again once his wife was finally identified. He assured investigators that he had always been cooperative and had provided all possible information years ago. According to him, he had no motive to harm Melissa. There was no insurance policy, no assets, no debts. He emphasized that he would never have disposed of the remains near his workplace, knowing it would draw suspicion. Christopher even spoke to reporters, insisting that he genuinely believed Melissa had changed her name and started a new life somewhere, hoping that one day she would return, at least for the sake of their children. That was why he never filed a missing persons report. The loss hit Tina, Melissa's older sister, the hardest. To her, it wasn't just an unresolved case, but a constant haunting pain. She even had nightmares where Melissa called out for help, but Tina couldn't reach her. Carl, sitting in prison, also changed. He wanted justice for his daughter, but he couldn't help. It seemed that losing Melissa was the first time he truly felt the pain that the families of his own victims had endured. The most shocking aspect of the story was that Carl, a convicted criminal, spent his final years fighting for justice for Melissa. Despite his apparent love for his daughter, her death remained a mystery. Her remains had been found, but there were no arrests, no charges. In 2017, Norma Patton reached out again, this time to Cheryl McCullum, an investigator specializing in cold cases. Cheryl, known for her true crime podcasts and shows, first met Norma at an official dinner. That evening, Norma approached her and, without hesitation, said, "My daughter was decapitated, and I need your help," and so began a new investigation. Cheryl McCullum knew the case wouldn't be easy, and immediately suggested to Norma that they re-examine all the evidence. She organized a new search of the wooded area where the bags with remains had been found years ago, trying to piece together fragments of the puzzle, hoping to find even a single new clue. But so far, the efforts had not been successful. Norma wasn't ready to give up. She believed that the truth about her daughter's death would eventually come to light, and Cheryl continued to dig into Melissa Wolfenberger's case, searching for that one missing piece that could reveal the whole story. When investigator Cheryl McCullum began her work, she could hardly have imagined just how many dark corners she would have to illuminate. From the start, she was able to establish correspondence with Carl Patton, Melissa's father. In his letters, Carl shared personal memories and his thoughts on who he believed was responsible for his daughter's disappearance. The one name he kept mentioning over and over was her husband, Christopher Wolfenberger. Carl had no illusions about his son-in-law. He believed that Christopher had ruined his daughter's life from the moment they met. Once, Melissa had been a bright, cheerful person, but everything changed when Christopher entered her life. According to Carl, it was Christopher who coaxed her into sneaking out of the house at night to meet him, taught her to steal, and twice tried to steal Carl's car to run off to California with Melissa. When she became pregnant and had their daughter, his control over her became absolute. He worked to isolate her from her parents, and the only time Norma and Carl ever saw their granddaughter, Christina, was when Christopher was at work. Melissa spoke in a frightened whisper, saying she would be in big trouble if her husband found out her parents had. Carl recalled how, despite the constant bruises on her arms and neck left by Christopher, Melissa wouldn't listen to his warnings. She believed she could get her life back on track. But when she didn't show up for Christmas, Carl knew something had gone terribly wrong. He was convinced Christopher was involved in her disappearance, but proving it was another matter entirely. What tormented Carl the most was knowing that his grandchildren didn't understand that their mother hadn't left to start a new life, but that she was gone for good. In his letters, Carl described how he tried to assist the investigation, despite being behind bars. He urged the experts to examine the trash bags containing the remains for any DNA traces, suggesting that whoever tied the knots might have left evidence. There's no such thing as a perfect crime, he wrote, but the police were never able to find any proof linking Christopher to the case. Carl held on to the hope that the investigation would eventually yield results. Cheryl McCullum met with Norma several times, where she shared her suspicions in detail. Norma was convinced that Christopher was behind her daughter's death. Carl's letters reflected his desire to uncover the truth. He was willing to cooperate, despite his reputation as a convicted criminal. However, detectives still couldn't connect Christopher to Melissa's disappearance. At the end of one of his letters, Carl thanked Cheryl for her efforts, noting that he had only come to understand the gravity of his own crimes after losing his daughter. It took experiencing that kind of loss for him to grasp what the families of his victims had felt. He prayed that his grandchildren would one day learn the truth about their mother. Cheryl McCullum also explored the possibility of involving the children of Liddy Evans, one of Carl's victims, to see if any relatives might have had a motive for revenge. The police considered the theory that someone connected to Carl's past crimes might have sought retaliation, but this hypothesis quickly fell apart. Carl's crimes only came to light years after Melissa's disappearance. Liddy's children agreed to be interviewed on a podcast to discuss her story, as they believed Melissa also deserved justice. Despite the fact that her father was a criminal, one of the forensic experts, Joseph Morgan, spoke about the autopsy findings. He speculated that Melissa's dismemberment might not have occurred at home, but rather at the glass company where Christopher worked. The remains were found at a dump site near the building, and all the necessary tools for such an act were available on the premises. However, the police found no blood or DNA traces at the facility, which prevented them from confirming this theory. It remained unclear where the crime had taken place, and, most importantly, who was responsible for it. Cheryl made sure not to overlook even the smallest details. She brought in specialists, reviewed all the case materials, and kept a constant correspondence with Carl. All the experts seemed to agree on one thing: the most likely suspect remained Christopher. McCullum stated she was willing to put her reputation on the line to see the perpetrator brought to justice. Melissa's story was the first one she covered on her podcast, launched in February 2023. Then, in April 2024, a listener contacted her claiming to have witnessed a confrontation between Melissa and Christopher at a party. This information breathed new life into the case, giving it fresh momentum. Investigators jumped back into action with renewed energy. In early August, after more than 2 decades of uncertainty, Christopher Wolfenberger was arrested on suspicion of a serious crime. Detectives revisited old leads, re-interviewed witnesses, and used new technology to piece everything together. When officers arrived at his home, he tried to hide behind a dryer. "Not the behavior of an innocent man," one of the officers commented. Christopher continued to maintain his innocence, but the charges were already in place. Norma and Tina were present at the press conference. Norma clasped her hands and quietly prayed when she heard the announcement of the arrest. "Now he's behind bars," she said, standing before the cameras, and I hope he stays there. The police did not disclose all the evidence that led to the arrest, and Christopher's motives were still unclear. But one thing was certain: 25 years after Melissa's disappearance, her family finally had hoped that justice would prevail. I shared this story with you because even after years pass and everything seems lost, the truth has a way of resurfacing. The Patton family fought for their daughter despite all the challenges and public scrutiny, and their perseverance was rewarded. This case shows that wrongdoing cannot be ignored. Families facing abusive behavior often find themselves in desperate situations, but silence and hiding the truth are not the answers. If Melissa could speak to you now, she would say, "Don't let yourself be broken." On Sunday, December 4th, 2016, 32-year-old Rosemeyer Silva and her 30-year-old fiancé, Yudurlai Damasceno, were getting ready for their wedding ceremony set to take place in a picturesque rural area near São Paulo. Rosemeyer had planned an impressive surprise, a dramatic entrance by helicopter to dazzle the guests and her future husband. But just moments before the ceremony was set to begin, an unforeseen tragedy turned everything into a nightmare. Rosemeyer was a 32-year-old nurse assistant, born and raised in São Paulo in a large family. From an early age, her parents instilled values of kindness and caring, guiding her toward a career dedicated to helping others. Colleagues often praised her hard work, patience, and warm demeanor, and patients always felt they had her full attention. Outside of work, Rosemeyer was an active, joyful individual who enjoyed socializing with friends, participating in charity events at her local church, and ensuring her loved ones felt happy and secure. Rosemeyer had dreamed of her wedding day since childhood. In her mind, she envisioned walking down an aisle adorned with flowers, surrounded by the smiles of friends and family, dressed in a stunning white gown. These dreams had motivated her to save money diligently for the perfect celebration. One special touch she planned was her grand arrival by helicopter, a surprise that would captivate everyone in attendance. Outierly, then 30, was a mechanic who also hailed from São Paulo and grew up in a hardworking family that valued honesty and simplicity. From a young age, he showed a keen interest in mechanics and gradually built a career as a skilled professional. Outierly was known for being calm, composed, and dependable, with a reputation for always doing his job with integrity. He had previously been married, a union that ended in divorce, but he maintained a strong relationship with his daughter from that marriage, spending as much time with her as possible. The two met at an evangelical church, and while their connection wasn't immediate, it soon deepened. Initially, they approached their conversations cautiously, like two strangers unsure of their commonalities. However, their bond grew quickly, revealing that they were indeed meant for each other. The couple began dating in 2015, and within a year, Outierly proposed, a moment that Rosemary joyfully embraced, preparing for the wedding. When Rosemary and Outierly announced their engagement, they dove into planning their wedding. Rosemary was determined for everything to be perfect, from the choice of flowers and music to the seating arrangements and venue decorations. This day was meant to be a fairy tale, and Rosemary envisioned each guest reminiscing about it with joy. One aspect of the wedding, however, stood out. Rosemary planned an unforgettable surprise: her dramatic arrival by helicopter. This had been her dream, to make an entrance that would be remembered, descending from the sky like a vision. She arranged for a light commercial helicopter, a Robinson ARP-44, and made plans with pilot Peterson Pinheiro, keeping this detail under wraps. Only 6 people, including her brother Silvano Silva and photographer Nela Cristina Neves, who was set to capture the moment, knew of the plan. The final hours before the flight. On the morning of her wedding day, Rosemary woke up early, unable to sleep due to excitement. At the beauty salon, she was met with smiles and congratulations as the stylist carefully worked on her hair and makeup. All the while, she imagined her grand entrance, descending from above and seeing the awe on her guests' faces. This vision had occupied her mind for months. She knew the surprise would be the highlight of the day. By 2 p.m., dressed in her white wedding gown, Rosemary headed to a nearby town where the helicopter would take off. With her was her older brother Silvano, a 40-year-old who had always been her pillar of support. Although he, like many in their family, was uneasy about the flight, he couldn't deny his sister her wish. Photographer Nayla, who was expecting a child, joined them, ready to document every joyful moment. By 3:30 p.m., the helicopter took off. Initially, the flight was smooth. Rosemary sat beside her brother, holding his hand and smiling in anticipation of the moment she would see her fiancé and their guests. Nayla captured it all on video, ensuring every glance and smile would be immortalized in their wedding album. The shift in the skies. But soon things changed. The weather began to deteriorate as clouds gathered, followed by fog and rain. Despite this, the pilot remained confident in his abilities and continued. Below them were stretches of forest and roads, and the passengers, still unaware of the impending danger, chatted calmly. Moments leading up to the tragedy. Meanwhile, at the ceremony site, a subtle restlessness grew. Guests had gathered and were waiting for the event to begin. The officiant informed Outierly that his bride was running slightly late due to the changing weather conditions. Standing by the arch, Outierly fidgeted nervously with the fabric of his suit, not knowing where Rosemary was, but certain she would arrive any minute. The officiant, who was aware of the surprise, maintained a composed demeanor and spoke occasionally with the organizers to ensure everything was proceeding as planned. Yet, as the minutes ticked by, the organizers' concerns started to mount. By 4 p.m., the absence of the helicopter began to seem ominous. Tension on board. As the helicopter soared through worsening weather, the atmosphere inside grew tense. Visibility was dwindling, and the pilot had to rely on instruments to navigate through the dense fog. Silvano, already uneasy about flying, showed clear signs of anxiety, gripping Rosemary's hand tightly as she tried to reassure him. Nayla, the photographer, kept recording, but her camera occasionally shook, betraying the tension that had overtaken everyone on board. Approaching the venue, the pilot attempted to descend to locate a safe landing spot. However, with visibility severely compromised, the maneuver turned risky. Suddenly, the helicopter's tail clipped a tree, triggering an uncontrollable descent. Just over a mile from the wedding site, the helicopter crashed, igniting on impact. The growing concern at the wedding. As time ticked by, those in on Rosemary's surprise plan began to feel a sense of foreboding. Carlos Eduardo, the wedding coordinator who had helped organize the flight, called the helicopter company to check on its status. He was told that the flight had departed as scheduled and should have already arrived. This response deepened his worry, prompting him to try contacting the pilot directly. Every call went unanswered. The phone rang out without response, and Carlos and the other organizers scrambled to find alternative ways to track the helicopter's whereabouts. The company's staff also attempted to reach the pilot, but without success. Meanwhile, whispers and worried glances spread among the guests as they noticed Carlos's anxious demeanor. While no one wanted to spark alarm, the atmosphere grew thick with unease. The moment of realization. Another 15 minutes passed, and the anxious waiting turned to rising panic. The organizers decided to reach out to local authorities, trying to find out if there had been any reports of an incident nearby. That's when they received news confirming their worst fears, a report of a helicopter crash close to the wedding location. Although it was not confirmed if it was the same flight carrying Rosemary, the information alone was enough to send a chill through everyone involved. Carlos Eduardo, unsure of how to break the news to the groom, confided in the pastor. Together they approached Udurl to share what they knew. There had been a report of a possible helicopter crash just a few miles away. At first, Udurl struggled to comprehend. He hadn't even known that Rosemary planned to arrive by helicopter. The pastor gently explained that it had a surprise Rosemary arranged for the guests and for him, but the words seemed incomprehensible. Standing there in stunned silence, Udurl looked at the pastor and Carlos Eduardo as the realization set in. The world around him seemed to fade, the sounds of the gathering dulling into a silent void. All eyes turned toward him as the weight of the situation became clear. Rosemary could have been on that helicopter. No one knew how to react, and the silence that followed felt endless. The arrival of the news. Within minutes, Reports confirmed that emergency responders had reached the crash site. Initially, details were scarce as they worked to assess the situation. Police cordoned off the area to prevent onlookers from entering and began their investigation. Word of the crash filtered back to the wedding venue, intensifying the guests' anxiety with every passing moment. One of the event organizers advised waiting for official confirmation before jumping to conclusions, but everyone could sense that the chance of a hopeful outcome was slipping away. The groom could hear murmurs among the guests behind him, and he knew that nobody would share the truth until the details were certain. The event, meant to be a day of joy, was slowly descending into disarray as whispers spread like wildfire. The scene at the crash site while the guests waited anxiously at the venue. First responders were already hard at work at the crash site. The helicopter had gone down in a wooded area not far from a highway. Upon impact, the fuselage had caught fire, and the flames quickly consumed what remained of aircraft. Firefighters fought to contain the blaze, and after a while, they managed to reach the wreckage. It became clear that none of the passengers had survived, a revelation that sent shockwaves of grief and dread through those trying to piece together what had happened. Police officers began collecting evidence and examining the site for clues to understand the cause of the crash. Debris was scattered across a confined area, and one officer discovered a camera that had continued recording even after the impact. The footage could potentially provide crucial insights into the final moments of the flight, but for now, the reason behind the tragedy remained unknown, returning to a harsh reality. When the official confirmation of the crash finally reached the wedding venue, the hope for a miracle was shattered. The pastor, with a heavy heart, approached Uderl and broke the devastating news. Pain etched itself into the groom's expression as he struggled to comprehend what he was hearing. In that moment, the world seemed to collapse around him, and those who stood by his side were left in stunned silence, unsure how to respond to such overwhelming grief. Guests stricken by shock. The guests, who had arrived to celebrate love and happiness, now stood in stunned silence, uncertain of what to say or do. The ceremony, anticipated with so much joy, had devolved into a scene of disbelief and sorrow. What was meant to be a beautiful day was now a harsh reminder of how quickly a single error or unforeseen event could unravel lives and plans in mere moments. Investigative efforts begin. Investigators from Brazil's National Civil Aviation Agency commenced their analysis of the flight data and began gathering witness statements. Those who had attended the wedding or were aware of Rosemeyer's plans were of particular interest. The inquiry aimed to uncover not just the technical reasons behind the crash, but also the motivation for her decision to take such a high-risk approach for her arrival. Aviation safety experts and police meticulously examined the wreckage. One of their first tasks was retrieving the flight data and reviewing recordings that could provide crucial insights. Determining why the helicopter veered off course and lost control was essential. While dense fog and worsening weather were potential factors, other possibilities were also on the table, such as pilot error or mechanical failure. Insight into the pilot's background. Witness accounts from those who knew the pilot, Peterson Pinheiro, added layers to the investigation. An experienced and highly regarded professional, Pinheiro was known for his caution and responsible handling of each flight. He had years of experience and had successfully completed many flights under challenging weather conditions. Colleagues noted that he was thorough in assessing risks before taking off. This background made the news of the crash all the more perplexing to those who worked with him. Many found it hard to believe that he could have made a critical mistake. However, the facts remained undeniable. In heavy fog and rain, the helicopter had clipped a tree and spun out of control. Investigators sought to piece together the final moments of the flight to determine if there had been any opportunity for a safe landing. Family in shock. While investigators worked at the crash site, the families of Rosemeyer and New Dearly were left grappling with unimaginable grief. Parents, siblings, and close friends struggled to accept that this tragedy had actually occurred. Rosemeyer's sister, one of the few who knew about her plan to arrive by helicopter, recalled their discussions. Rosemeyer had been so excited, full of enthusiasm, at the thought of surprising everyone with her entrance. Yet no one could have anticipated that this would be the final flight of her life. New Dearly's heartbreak. Standing by the wedding arch, New dearly struggled to process the loss. He saw guests and organizers trying to comfort one another, but it offered him no solace. The realization that he hadn't known about Rosemary's surprise weighed heavily on him. He felt as though he had failed her, unable to protect her. What should have been the beginning of their life together had instead become his most painful memory. Initial investigation findings. Investigators soon released a preliminary report confirming that weather conditions played a critical role in the crash. The helicopter had encountered dense fog, severely limiting visibility. Pilot Peterson had attempted an emergency landing but clipped a tree with the tail of the aircraft, leading to a loss of control and the tragic crash. However, the investigation was far from over. It was essential to determine why the helicopter was flying at such a low altitude, and why the pilot couldn't avoid the collision. The camera found among the wreckage could hold valuable clues for reconstructing the final moments of the flight, and experts began reviewing the footage. Painful as it was, this step was necessary to understand what had happened in those last moments. Aftermath. At the ceremony, as the guests slowly began to leave the venue, an eerie silence hung over the space. No one had the strength to speak. The organizers worked to coordinate with local authorities, while Uderlai's friends and family offered him as much support as they could. But lingering questions tormented everyone. Why did this happen? What could have caused such a devastating outcome? Rosemary's family was also reeling, struggling to come to terms with the tragedy. Her mother, who had always been her biggest supporter, couldn't accept that their morning conversation was their last. She recalled how Rosemary had spoken with excitement, calling her plan a gift from the skies that would amaze everyone. No one imagined that her dream would turn into such questions and theories. Before long, new concerns emerged regarding the safety of the flight itself. Investigators discovered that the helicopter did not have authorization for charter services. Its license permitted only private flights. Why had the company agreed to provide it for the wedding? Who was responsible for overlooking the weather conditions? These questions spurred further inquiries and became a focal point of the investigation. Witness accounts and weather concerns. Some witnesses began to recall that in the days leading up to the wedding, weather forecasts had predicted poor conditions, yet little attention was given to these warnings. Pilot Peterson Pinheiro, known for his careful consideration of safety, would have had to factor in these conditions, yet the flight was still approved. The investigation now had to determine who made the final call to proceed with the flight, despite the clear risks. Uderlai's grief and the overwhelming silence as Uderlai tried to gather his thoughts. Each moment of waiting felt unbearable. He couldn't imagine a life without Rosemary, who had brought so much light and warmth into his world. Their journey, which started with shy glances in church, was supposed to lead to a life of shared happiness. Now it felt shattered, like a picture that could never be made whole again. The hall, once meant to echo with wedding music and joyous speeches, was enveloped in a heavy silence. Only soft cries, quiet words of comfort, and supportive embraces could be heard. No one knew what to say to Uderlai or how to console a man who had just lost everything he cherished. The investigation and its impact. The investigation continued for weeks, but the helicopter crash that claimed the lives of Rosemary, her brother Silvano, photographer Nayla, and pilot Peterson left a permanent scar on the hearts of their families and the wider community. While more facts came to light over time, one feeling persisted among those who knew the victims: an overwhelming sense of loss and bitter injustice. Final report from aviation authorities. A month after the tragic event, the Brazilian National Civil Aviation Agency completed its report. It confirmed that the primary factors contributing to the crash were the severe weather conditions and poor visibility. Pilot Peterson Pinheiro had attempted to navigate through dense fog and rain, but found himself in a critical situation when the helicopter lost control at a low altitude. The pivotal moment was the collision with a tree, which led to the fatal crash. The report also revealed that the helicopter used by Rosemary did not have authorization for charter flights. Its registration only permitted private use, and allowing it to be used for a wedding was a violation of safety regulations. This revelation stirred anger among the victims' families and brought attention to the company that rented out the helicopter. Accountability and legal action. Further investigations showed that the company responsible for leasing the helicopter had failed to properly assess the weather conditions and allowed the flight to proceed despite warnings of poor visibility. This was deemed a serious breach, and after the investigation concluded, several lawsuits were filed against the company and its owners. The families of those who perished sought answers, wanting to know why the flight had been approved under such conditions and who should have made the decision to cancel it. The company's defense and legal fallout. The helicopter company claimed that the pilot had independently determined that the flight could be safely carried out. However, further evidence indicated that the company did not have authorization to use the aircraft for commercial purposes, sparking further scrutiny. This led to a temporary suspension of their licenses and a comprehensive audit of their operations. Families' unbearable grief. As the investigation pressed on, the families of Rosemeyer and the other victims prepared for the funerals. It was a moment none of them wanted to face. It's one thing to see dreams shattered. It's another to come to terms with the absence of loved ones. The funeral was solemn and attended by hundreds who came to pay their respects. The silence and tears spoke volumes, expressing more than words ever could. Utterly stood by Rosemeyer's casket, unable to find the words to convey his grief. His eyes were hollow and his spirit seemed hardened by the weight of his sorrow. He had envisioned spending his entire life with Rosemeyer, but everything had changed in an instant. Standing before her casket, he felt as though his heart might break completely. He couldn't say goodbye, unable to accept that this was truly the end. Calls for change. After the funeral, Rosemeyer's family and friends launched a campaign advocating for increased safety measures in private aviation. Their hope was that no one else would ever endure such a devastating loss due to oversight or negligence. This tragedy resonated with the public, garnering widespread support for stricter regulations and mandatory oversight to ensure flight safety compliance. Rosemeyer's memory, along with that of her brother and the other victims, was honored in their local church, a place they frequented. Despite his pain, Uterly resolved to keep their legacy alive. He established a small fund to help families affected by similar tragedies, offering them resources to navigate their grief. The final report. After several months, investigators released their final report. It confirmed that the main cause of the tragedy was severe weather conditions and limited visibility, leading to the loss of control. A contributing factor was the company's failure to follow proper rental procedures and adequately assess the risks involved. The company was fined and had its flight licenses temporarily revoked until all identified shortcomings were addressed. Although the investigation provided many answers, it could not bring back those who were lost. While families received compensation, it did little to ease the pain of their grief. For Uterly and everyone who knew Rosemeyer, it was merely a symbolic gesture that couldn't undo what had happened. Months after the tragedy, life slowly resumed its usual rhythm for most. But for Uterly, this was impossible. He continued to go to work and meet with friends, but the spark that once lit his eyes was gone. The loss of Rosemeyer left a void in his heart that nothing could fill. In the evenings, he often found himself revisiting memories of the happiness they shared and wishing that day could have ended differently. What began as a dream for a surprise revealed how fragile life truly is and how a single ill-fated decision can change everything. Rosemeyer wanted her wedding day to be unforgettable, and in a tragic way it was, but not in the way she had imagined. If you made it this far, thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope the stories gave you something to think about, or dream about. Sleep well, stay safe, and don't forget to subscribe. Good night.